Question 3. What are the key causes and characteristics of left-wing populism? And
to what extent are these factors similar different in the global north and global south context? Chantal Mouffe on the rise of left-wing populism. Populist moment. Post-democracy. Conceptualizing left-wing populism. Chantal Mouffe on left-wing populism. Left-wing populism is a response to the populist moment, a crisis of neoliberal hegemony that has led to the erosion of two pillars of democracy, equality and popular sovereignty. The post-democracy era originating in the Reagan and Thatcher revolutions has led to a process of disaffection with democracy and institutions, with rising levels of voter abstention and support for right-wing populist parties. Mouffe's left-wing populism is best understood as a discursive strategy of populism which establishes its political frontiers on the conflict between the people and the oligarchy with the goal of deepening democracy. The populist moment is characterized by an emerging set of demands that no longer correspond to definitive social categories. Oscar Garcia on the rise of left-wing populism. Party system crisis, corruption, political movements. A definition of left-wing populism. Together, these factors provide for a definition of left-wing populism as outlined by Oscar Garcia 2020. Left-wing populism is a combination of a populist motive and the desire to expand democratic representation through appeal to the people against the elites and the left-wing tradition of promoting equality and social justice. The focus of left-wing populists is on the expansion of democratic participation, which is as integral to their project as the concepts of the people and the elite are to populism. Historically, the focus of left-wing populism has been confined to a critique of the neoliberal economic order due to its inherently political nature. Contemporary left-wing populism's push for greater representation includes a variety of issues which have become increasingly important to its cause. For example, gender equality, immigration, climate change, and the advancement of human rights. Over time, the focus of left populism has shifted away from a purely economic-oriented critique of neoliberalism, a political approach that favors free market capitalism, deregulation, and reduction in government spending, to a more expansive movement for democratic expansion, aims at providing democratic rights and freedoms to historically oppressed and marginalized communities that fall outside of traditional class-based cleavages or that may cut across class lines. Characteristics of left-wing populism. Ultimately, contemporary left-wing populism entails three major characteristics. Oscar Garcia 2020. The first is transversality, where the goal of achieving greater levels of representation requires the agendas and proposals of left-wing populists to go beyond the typical left versus right dichotomy which has historically defined the electoral and political domains. For example, democracy versus neoliberalism. The second is inclusiveness, where the goal of advocating for the representation of a plurality of diverse interests in society requires that populism breaks free from its conceptualization as an inherently anti-pluralist phenomenon. For example, mobilization beyond class identity. The third is participation, where direct democratic participation and representation are key aspects to facilitating trust between voters and elected representatives. Crisis of representation. Would you agree with Chantal Mouffe's assertion that we are currently living in a populist moment where a crisis of representation is increasingly likely to push voters towards populist alternatives? The rise of left-wing populism is a result of a crisis of representation caused by the party system, corruption, and social movements. Populists on the left oppose idealized notions of liberal and representative democracy due to a representation gap, leading to a crisis of representation. Key features of the European populist left. Defining features of the contemporary European populist left. Oscar Garcia 2020. The first is that it seeks to be an alternative to social democracy. The second is that it seeks to be an alternative to right-wing populism. The third is that it has been utilized by parties of the center-left. The fourth is that it relies on charismatic relationship. And the fifth is that they represent movement parties. Alternative to social democracy. The crisis of social democracy has led to the emergence of movements and political parties seeking to supplant it. This has been demonstrated by the transition towards third-way politics and the decline of mainstream parties. This has given the populist left the potential to mobilize an electorate large enough to overtake the mainstream left. Parties have adopted the idea of redefining social democracy by reaffirming its key tenets and replacing them with a new vision for political and economic democracy. This is seen to save social democracy by replacing it with a new vision. Alternative to right-wing populism. The decline of social democratic parties has led to the emergence of other party families such as the populist right, which are now more influential than left-wing populist parties. Given the striking degree of difference in the agendas of the populist left and right, left-wing populist parties also seek to provide an alternative direction for Europe that moves away from the divisive and harmful agendas of the radical right. For example, Greece and Spain. Recall Mouth's claim the post-democracy era is characterized by a fight between the populist left and the populist right. The degree to which left-wing populism has become an element within the mainstream left varies by country, with the British Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn being the most prominent example. Corbyn himself has been regarded as a left-wing populist leader. Corbyn's agenda and rhetoric focused on a people-elite dichotomy, focusing on British workers and a fight against neoliberalism and austerity while trying to reverse third-way politics dating back to the Tony Blair era. Charismatic leadership. Much like their Latin American counterparts, the success of left-wing populism in Europe also relies heavily on charismatic leaders who are willing to lead the movement as a political party. Prominent examples include both Alexis Tsipras and Pablo Iglesias in Greece and Spain, who led Syriza and Podemos to historic electoral victories. It is arguably true that the major left-wing populist movements over the past decade in Europe would not have been successful without the influence of the leaders which spearheaded the movements. Movement parties. Lastly, left-wing populism in the European context can be characterized as emerging from large-scale social movements demanding political representation. By far the most influential movements to have emerged in recent history are those in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis, which have promoted the politics of anti-austerity and the renewal of social democracy. Several of these movements have resulted in important electoral victories for parties of the populist left, for example in France, Spain, and Greece. Supporters of the populist left in Europe. In general, these parties have attracted the votes of constituencies that are consistent with the new globalization cleavage. Senator and Rama 2018. Studies have found that younger voters with higher levels of education and those who reside in urban city centers are more likely to support left-wing populist parties compared with right-wing populist parties. Fernandez Alberto's 2015. Orioles and Cordero 2016. The so-called losers of globalization who are most negatively impacted by this phenomenon have increasingly tended to support populist parties on the right. Individuals in this group typically include those with blue-collar backgrounds, particularly in manual occupations, the unemployed or underemployed, and older, less educated voters. The winners of globalization are more likely to support green, liberal, and mainstream center-left parties, while skepticism towards the EU has also been predictive of support for the populist left. Transversality, inclusiveness, participation. Characteristics of left-wing populism. Contemporary left-wing populism entails three major characteristics: transversality, inclusiveness, and participation. Transversality is the goal of achieving greater levels of representation, while inclusiveness is the goal of advocating for the representation of a plurality of diverse interests. Participation is key to facilitating trust between voters and elected representatives, while direct democratic participation and representation are key aspects to facilitating trust between voters and elected representatives. Left-wing populism and the socialist tradition. Left-wing populism is heavily influenced by socialist traditions, as socialism itself has been seen as intrinsically populist. Socialist parties have attempted to mobilize voters using a class-based strategy that draws on the Marxist tradition of the struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisies. For instance, Laclau has regarded socialism as the highest form of populism. The tradition of left-wing populism is derived from a socialist past, but today it has expanded to include a broader national people who share a common liberation interest. Their focus is increasingly on an inclusive agenda of egalitarianism, with economic and class-based issues and interests playing a central but not the only role. The radicalism of these movements varies, with some supportive of working within the system to advocate for their cause and others supportive of system overthrow. For example, in Latin America, left-wing populists are advocating for more substantive representation due to their critique of liberal democracy. They are hostile to the idealized notions of liberal and representative democracy, which have led to a representation gap in which many people feel less represented. This has led to a flurry of populist dissatisfaction and mobilization due to the large gap between liberal democracy's promise and its reality. The democratic vision of left populists is rooted in a notion of economic democracy, which has strong roots in socialist thought. This system is concerned with creating a society oriented towards human equality and social justice, rather than the generation of profits and wealth maximization. It is meant to ensure that all citizens are provided with the necessities of life so that they can engage in a market economy, rather than a system based on an unfettered market economy. In Europe, arose out of new politics of post-industrial transformations and decline of mainstream parties. Third way, collapse of communism. EU expansion, shocks crises left-wing populism in Europe. Left-wing populist parties in Europe emerged in the 1990s due to the new politics era, where mainstream parties were seen as having sold out to the establishment and abandoned their supporters. This was a key driving force for the rising levels of support for both left and right-wing populist parties during this period. Part of the populist backlash in this period is rooted in the rising prominence of third-way approaches adopted by major parties in the aftermath of the decline of the Keynesian economic consensus and the transition to the neoliberal economic model. Specifically, the shift from a growth-oriented model focused on the policy goal of full employment and a demand-side management of the economy to one characterized by the policy goal of low inflation and a supply-side management of the economy has resulted in a convergence in the agendas of mainstream parties. Social democratic parties' shift towards the economic right has caused voters to look for alternative sources of political representation, leading to the rise of left-wing populist alternatives. In Latin America, three waves of populism from 1929 contemporary era left-wing populism in Latin America. The rise of populism in Latin America. MUD. Latin America has the strongest historical traditions of left-wing populism, and the region is home to some of the strongest left-wing movements in the world. This is due to higher levels of socio-economic inequality in the region, which has made left-wing populism a staple of the political sphere for some time. Latin America has experienced three waves of populist movements in its modern history. The Great Depression of 1929 to 1960 caused a crisis of incorporation in the region, with rising rates of migration from rural to urban areas, and the implementation of economic agendas led to demands for rights. This was the initial era of leftist populism in countries like Argentina, Brazil and Ecuador. MUD. The era of import substitution industrialization, IC, was associated with a nationalistic leftist agenda advocating for socio-economic development through state-led initiatives and social democratic reforms. This model was associated with the peasant and working classes, while the elite was a national oligarchic class subservient to international capitalist forces. The Latin American populist left was strongly supportive of the notion that class consciousness and politics was the predominant cleavage along which the electorate should mobilize. This model was based on mass populist parties led by charismatic leaders, who headed social movements that revolved around a fluid and unstable coalition of trade unions and different factions within the electorate. The conflict lines in Latin American society were based on the labor-capital cleavage. The second wave of populism emerged in the early 1990s due to economic crises, where populist leaders were able to gain electoral victories by blaming the elite. This second wave was characterized by an elite-driven backlash to the highly state-centric and isolationist model of the IC era. The third wave of populism was ushered in with the 1998 victory of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, which subsequently spread to a number of countries. This third wave was characterized by an elite-driven backlash to the highly state-centric and isolationist model of the IC era. This wave of populist leaders is characterized by an anti-neoliberal, anti-American populism rooted in 21st-century socialism. They view themselves as radical leftists dedicated to fighting against excessive free market reforms and neoliberalism with the aim of uplifting the poorest in society. They view the people as those who have been exploited and discriminated against, while the elite as a financial elite and Western powers with imperialist ambitions. They are committed to the expansion of democratic rights and the establishment of participatory democracy. Contemporary causes: social inequality, neoliberalism, electoral politics, indigenous rights, social inequality. Historically speaking, the region has had some of the highest levels of social inequality in the world. This continues to be the case today. History of colonialism and the influence of colonial institutions on long-term development. Emergence of neoliberalism. Dependency theory. Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a key concept in populism literature, and its dominance has led to the rise of support for populist parties. This has been attributed to the dominance of the neoliberal economic system paradigm that now constitutes the economic system of the majority of countries. Populism is a term used to refer to the post-1980s economic regime popularized in the US and UK. Neoliberalism is an economic and political ideology that emphasizes deregulation, privatization, austerity measures, rolling back of state services, and financialization. It advocates for individual freedom and expression and the support of markets as the best means to expand individual freedom and success. It has been critiqued for its tendency to create high levels of economic and income inequality, its subversion of the political realm to the economic realm, and its hostility towards organized labor. The model has been criticized for creating rising levels of informal and precarious work and unemployment, assaulting the welfare state, and expanding private alternatives. It has also been criticized for concentrating power in the hands of financial elite and multinational corporations and international organizations, which increasingly encroach on national states' domestic affairs. Electoral politics. The institutionalization of electoral politics and the use of elections as a main way through which to organize the political sphere provided new party families like the populist left with the ability to compete for office, a process from which they were previously excluded. This, coupled with declining levels of support for center-right parties, provided new opportunities for parties to craft new electoral coalitions. The struggle for indigenous rights. The struggle for indigenous rights is rooted in the region's colonial past and the institutionalization of exploitative and racially based hierarchies imposed by Spanish and Portuguese colonizers, which have had lasting effects on both the treatment and livelihoods of the region's indigenous populations. Indigenous people have historically been excluded from the national political affairs of countries in the region, and it is since the 1990s that large-scale indigenous social movements have erupted and have demanded the rights of sovereignty and self-determination. In the modern era, indigenous protest movements have achieved various degrees of success in having their demands met and by increasing the extent to which they have become represented within national politics. It has often been through the populist left, for example in Bolivia, that such movements have found more success in the political realm. Social inequality. Historically speaking, the region has had some of the highest levels of social inequality in the world. This continues to be the case today. History of colonialism and the influence of colonial institutions on long-term development. Emergence of neoliberalism. Dependency theory. 3 types of regimes: orthodox, statist, heterodox, and democratic governance: liberal democratic, radical democratic, plebiscitarian. In particular, 3 types of economic policy regimes have been implemented by these actors according to Levitsky and Way, 2011. Orthodox regimes, statist regimes, heterodox regimes. First, orthodox regimes in Brazil are those that adhere to neoliberalism and make investments in social policies to reduce inequality, such as privatization and trade liberalization. Examples include the Bolsa Familia and the PT. Second, statist regimes are characterized by high levels of state control of the economy and policies, such as nationalization, creation of state-run firms, regulation of FDI, and investments in social policy. Lastly, Heterodox regimes such as those under Rafael Correa in Ecuador engage in both orthodox and measures. The varieties of left populist rule in the 21st century have differed in their models of democratic governance, with liberal democratic regimes institutionalizing pluralism and radical democratic regimes combining it with new channels of popular participation. Question 4. What are the key causes and characteristics of right-wing populism, and to what extent are these factors similar different in the global north and global south contexts? Typology of the populist right. In the European context, there are several varieties of right-wing populist parties. Palinka 2013. The first are right-wing populist parties with or without pre-populist roots. An example of a populist party with pre-populist roots is the Austrian FPO Die-RS, which is rooted in a pan-German tradition which ultimately became a centerpiece for Nazism in the 20th century. An example of a populist party without pre-populist roots is the Dutch PVV, which emerged in the aftermath of the brief success of PIM for China as a largely single-issue party focused on anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim agendas. The second are right-wing populist parties with a national revisionist agenda. The most extreme right-wing populist parties in Europe are those that have a history of or are rooted in support for the continent's history with fascism and leaders such as Mussolini, Franco, and Hitler. The revisionism of these parties often entails either a disapproval of the outcome of the Second World War or in the expression of an idealized past under fascist governance and an explicit rejection of liberal democracy and the concept of universal human rights. These parties are highly xenophobic and openly racist in ideology and advocate for their agendas on the grounds of racial and ethnic superiority. Examples of these parties include the German NPD, the Golden Dawn in Greece, and the British National Party and the Examples of these parties include the German NPD, the Golden Dawn in Greece, and the British National Party and the A third group are right-wing populist parties of Western and post-communist Europe. The most prominent of these types are those found in the Nordic countries, which have typically been regarded as safe havens from the far right. However, the emergence of parties including the Danish People's Party, the Sweden Democrats, the True Finns, and the Norwegian Progressive Party since the 1980s have given rise to significant levels of anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim sentiment in these countries and rising support for the radical right. The post-Soviet countries have also witnessed rising support for the populist right in countries such as Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, and Hungary, which have been characterized by strong ethno-nationalist politics and a rejection of the EU project. Currently, Hungary and Poland constitute two countries in which the populist right fully governs. Conceptualizing right-wing populism. Key variables for understanding right-wing populism. A comprehensive understanding of the phenomenon of right-wing populism requires a multifaceted approach which pays attention to three important variables. Onus and Cutley 2020. 1. Economic variables. 2. Identity cultural variables. 3. Domestic foreign policy variables. Much like their counterparts on the left, populists on the right also emphasize anti-elite sentiment and growing dissatisfaction with the political and economic establishment as forces that are antithetical to the interests of the people. However, populists on the right tend to have rather close relationships with business interests and tend to govern under elite-driven agendas while continuing to rely on anti-elite rhetoric to win the public support. Economic and cultural dimensions. Both economic and cultural factors are vital to understanding the rise of the populist right, and the economic versus cultural backlash hypothesis alone is not suitable to explaining the phenomenon. The success of right-wing populists is often rooted in a combination of economic concerns and identity politics centered around religious, nationalist, and xenophobic rhetoric. 1. Such ideas are used to form the electoral coalitions needed to succeed despite the inconsistencies between their rhetoric and actions, that is, close connections with the elite. Thus, outside of the use of populist rhetoric, right-wing populism, with a focus on an exclusionary agenda, is fundamentally different than left-wing populism with its focus on an inclusionary. Economic and cultural dimensions. Populists on the right tend to have a narrow understanding of democracy rooted in majoritarianism. Right-wing populists are inherently exclusionary due to their strategy of polarization and division based on anti-pluralist discourse and exclusive nationalism. This often relies on the use of nationalism as a means of uniting the different groups whose interests may otherwise be antithetical to one another. The success of these parties is dependent on successfully positioning themselves as representatives of the majority against the elites and painting their opposition as part of the nationalist religious overtone of right-wing populism is particularly salient in the global south, whereas a religious ethnic overtone is more salient in the global north. These regimes are often characterized by initially higher growth rates which allow for a simultaneous process of vertical redistribution, that is, using economic resources to finance their partnerships with business elites. Horizontal redistribution, that is, using economic growth to finance social policies for the electorate, that together create a cross-class coalition that keeps them in power. The most important details in this text are that right-wing populist governments often come to power with promises of reducing economic inequality and improving the material conditions of their respective countries. However, once in power, their economic records tend to be characterized by persistently high inequality and corruption, but are more resilient than their left-wing counterparts despite such conditions. In general, the data do not suggest that right-wing populist governments are successful at substantially reducing inequality. Rather, wealth and income inequality tend to be hallmarks of societies in which right-wing populists have governed for long periods of time. The policy regimes of these governments tend to benefit the wealthiest members of society, such as Trump's 2017 tax cuts. Domestic foreign policy dimensions. The domestic foreign policy arenas are also important to right-wing populists who often draw on aggressive foreign policy styles as a way of increasing their support at home and as a way of diverting voter attention away from the shortcomings of their domestic political and economic agendas. Related to this dimension is the issue of a nationalist-globalist dichotomy. Although right-wing populists are both nativist and nationalist, they are not exclusively anti-globalization but rather desire a new kind of transnational political order. The contemporary populist right, anti-elitist, ethno-nationalist response to globalization. In the 21st century, right-wing populism is characterized by an anti-elitist ethno-nationalist project that draws on critiques of the global economic system and a domestically oriented ethno-nationalism that views the people as constituting the native-born and those with political and economic power as the elite. This anti-elitism is directed towards those responsible for the forces of Europeanization, globalization, and mass migration that have eroded national sovereignty and the rights of the people. The project of multiculturalism and large-scale immigration is seen as a way of denationalizing one's own nation and deconstructing one's own people. These projects are often seen as an attempt by left parties to expand their base and as a way of undermining national identity and the well-being of native-born Inglehart Norris's Silent Revolution in Reverse explanation. The Silent Revolution in Reverse. Inglehart and Norris 2017. The Silent Revolution thesis argued that rising levels of physical and material security in the post-war era opened up the electorate to new ideas and tolerance for out-group members, while material insecurity had the opposite effect. This era gave rise to a large-scale shift towards post-material values which emphasized the need to pursue social justice for historically excluded issues and societal groups. The silent revolution of the post-war era was fueled by both the demand and supply side of voters and parties. This trend was explained by two hypotheses: the scarcity hypothesis, economic decline reverses this trend, and the socialization hypothesis, values reflect pre-adult life conditions and change through intergenerational replacement. In Europe, nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism were characterized by nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism. These hypotheses explain why the silent revolution did not manifest in low-income and poorer countries. In the 1980s and into the 1990s, the populist rights movements towards pro-market positions and towards authoritarianism was successful in attracting the votes of key electorates. 1. Small business owners, white-collar workers, blue-collar workers, and the unemployed were favored in the 1990s, but this strategy was no longer viable due to the changing electoral landscape. During this period, many right-wing populist parties have increasingly adopted centrist and center-left positions on questions of redistribution. The Lang 2007. The contemporary setting has seen a shift in support for populist right parties, with voters most supportive of them reverting to center-left economic views and right-wing to far-right-wing socio-cultural views. This shift has been argued to be the new winning formula for right-wing populist parties. De Lang 2007. The defining policy feature of right-wing populist parties on this new dimension, which now largely defines their success, is that of welfare chauvinism. Typology of European right-wing populist parties. 1. With pre-populist roots, FPO diaresis. 2. Without pre-populist roots, PVV. 3. With national revisionism, NPD, Golden Dawn, BNP. 4. Post-communist Nordic, Hungary, Scandinavia. The changing agendas of the European right-wing populist parties. 1. Winning formula 1980s-1990s of right-wing economic agenda and right-wing socio-cultural agenda. 2. New winning formula post-1990s of center-to-center-left economic agenda and right-wing socio-cultural agenda. The contemporary populist right electorate. There are 6 key demographic predictors that have been found to influence support for the populist right. Alekia Paulau and Landis 2022. The first is that support for these parties is concentrated among older male voters. The second is that those on the lowest income strata are less likely to support these parties. Third is that although receiving unemployment benefits is positively associated with support for these parties, the relationship is not statistically significant when controlling for major attitudinal factors. Fourth is that managers are less. The contemporary populist right electorate. There are 6 key demographic predictors that have been found to influence support for the populist right. Alekia Paulau and Landis 2022. The first is that support for these parties is concentrated among older male voters. The second is that those on the lowest income strata are less likely to support these parties. Third is that although receiving unemployment benefits is positively associated with support for these parties, the relationship is not statistically significant when controlling for major attitudinal factors. Fourth is that managers are less likely to support these parties, whereas those employed in agriculture craft occupations and lower skilled operators are more likely to support these parties. Fifth is that individuals in urban areas are less likely to support these parties than those in rural areas. And sixth, individuals with higher levels of education are less likely to support these parties relative to those with lower levels of education. The historical context of right-wing populism in Europe. The emergence of the populist right as a viable electoral actor in Europe is largely a phenomenon of the 1990s to the contemporary period. These parties emerged on the scene in response to rising frustrations over the transformations within European politics and society, as well as the projects of European integration and large-scale immigration. Mudd and Kaltwerser 2017. Right-wing populism in the Global South. 1. Lack of support for neoliberal globalization hypothesis. 2. Neoliberalism and anti-elitist, offensive populism. 3. Growth-oriented model. 5. Religious, ethno-nationalism. One of the most interesting puzzles when it comes to how right-wing populism has unfolded in the Global South is the relative lack of applicability of the neoliberal globalization hypothesis, which has been central to the development of the right. Wing populist backlash argument in the European context as well as for left-wing populism in the Global South, Cumrall 2022. Specifically, it is important to recognize that both historically and in the modern era, neoliberal globalization does not equally penetrate countries across the world but does so in an uneven manner which gives rise to a different set of circumstances as they relate to the success of the populist right. Similarities. Question 5. What is the relationship between populism and democracy? What are the major ways in which the two are complementary and antithetical to one another? Does this relationship differ based on the nature of populism, that is left-right wing? Two streams, incompatible, for example Muller, and compatible, democracy and populism. There are two major streams of thought on the relationship between democracy and populism. One view is that populism and democracy are compatible due to its ability to unite and give a political voice to marginalized groups and restrain the elite's power. Populists may promote expansionary mechanisms of representation such as referenda and plebiscites. Another view is that populism and democracy are incompatible given the common ties between populist governance and authoritarianism. Populism can have both an inclusionary and exclusionary nature when it comes to its relationship with democracy, as it can lead to distrust between political institutions and citizens due to its dichotomizing of society between pure people and corrupt elites. Inclusionary populists seek to integrate previously marginalized groups into the political process to combat tyranny of the majority, while exclusionary populists divide and concentrate power in the hands of societal groups, leading to tyranny of the majority. Three boundaries are often used by populists to define their agendas: material, symbolic, and political. Inclusionary populism tends to be associated with populism on the left, while exclusionary populism tends to be associated with populism on the right. Ultimately, populism can have both a positive or negative effect on democracy as conceived of as a system of popular sovereignty and majority rule. Table source: Mudd and Kaltwerser 2017. Populism, a very short introduction. Oxford UP. Positive effects, negative effects. Populism can give voice to groups that do not feel represented by the political elite. Populism can use the notion and praxis of majority rule to circumvent minority rights. Populism can mobilize excluded sectors of society, improving their integration into the political system. Populism can use the notion and praxis of popular sovereignty to erode the institutions specialized in the protection of fundamental rights. Populism can improve the responsiveness of the political system by fostering the implementation of policies preferred by excluded sectors of society. Populism can promote the establishment of a new political cleavage, which impedes the formation of stable political coalitions. Populism can increase democratic accountability by making issues and policy spit of the political realm. Populism can lead to a moralization of politics whereby reaching agreements becomes extremely difficult if not impossible. Therefore, the process of populist politics can play a role in both a democratizing and a de-democratizing process. When it comes to the democratizing process, the effects of populist politics can have three effects. Mudd and Kaltwerser 2017. Liberalization, democratic transition, democratic deepening. When it comes to the de-democratizing process, the effects of populist politics can also have three effects. Mudd and Kaltwerser 2017. Democratic erosion, democratic breakdown, repressiveness, democratization, liberalization. The process of liberalization occurs in authoritarianism, where populism is used to loosen restrictions and expand individual and group rights. It can act as a frame of opposition which articulates people's demands for popular sovereignty and majority rule. This process occurs during the transition from a fully or partially authoritarian regime to an electoral democracy, where populism fosters the idea that voters should elect their leaders. Populism is aimed at political elites who have concentrated power in their own hands and undermined popular sovereignty. An example of this is the formation of the Party of the Democratic Revolution (PRD) in Mexico in 1989 due to its refusal to support free and fair elections. Democratization cont. Democratic deepening. The process of authoritarian to democratic evolution involves the use of populism as a means of demanding and improving participatory institutions and protecting fundamental rights and freedoms. Examples of this process can be found in Eastern European countries transitioning to democratic regimes and EU membership, such as Slovakia. The three phases of liberalization, democratic transition, and democratic deepening constitute the ways in which populism has been used in the process. Populism can lead to a democratic erosion of fundamental rights and institutions, such as the judiciary, the rule of law, and minority rights. An example of this is Viktor Orban's Fidesz party, which implemented reforms that have undermined Hungarian democracy after coming to power in 2010. Democratic breakdown. This process is a transition from an electoral democracy to a competitive authoritarian regime, where populism is used to tilt the rules of the game to the benefit of the populist actors. This is seen as working for the benefit of a corrupt elite who are not representing the general will of the people. An example of this is the regime of Alberto Fujimori in Peru, who during the 1992 electoral campaign suspended the country's constitution and closed parliament in the name of the people as a way of circumventing electoral competition. De-democratization. Repressiveness. This process marks the transition from competitive authoritarianism to full authoritarianism, in which populism is used by the faction seeking power to fully capture the institutions of the state and of governance. Examples of this transition are uncommon, with some arguing that Alexander Lukashenko's regime in Belarus constitutes a case of using populist messaging to increasingly transition towards a fully authoritarian regime. Together, the three phases of democratic erosion, democratic breakdown, and repressiveness constitute the ways in which populism has been used in the process of democratic to authoritarian evolution. Any questions, comments on populism and democracy? Common dimensions of inclusion-exclusion, material, symbolic, political. A key mechanism has facilitated this change. 1. Birth cohort effects, in which the younger generations who had grown up under more secure conditions in the aftermath of the Second World War began to replace the older generation whose ideas had been shaped by two world wars as well as the Great Depression. 2. Over time, the emergence of a material post-material cleavage provoked a reaction among older and less materially secure voters who felt threatened and left behind by the displacement of traditional values. Thus, a materialist reaction against post-materialism developed, which led to the emergence of xenophobic and authoritarian right-wing populist parties, as well as a decline in class-based voting. The transition from competitive authoritarianism to full authoritarianism is marked by the use of populism to capture the institutions of the state and governance. The post-material shift was particularly influential for the politics of the left, which was largely a working-class movement dedicated to the redistribution of income. However, the post-material left increasingly began to appeal to a more secure and emerging middle-class constituency, which is more marginally concerned with economic issues and more so by cultural issues. Therefore, support for right-wing populist parties is largely motivated by a cultural backlash associated with the rise of post-materialism and self-expression values, more so than by economic factors. The majority of the 20th century saw working-class voters support parties of the left, while middle and upper-class voters supported parties of the right. However, the post-material era brought with it declining emphasis on materialist issues and growing emphasis on post-materialist issues. This process, along with rising rates of immigration from countries with different cultures and religious traditions, sparked a counter-movement among some segments of working class voters who increasingly moved to the right in defense of traditional values and nationalism. This era saw voters embrace post-material values such as environmental concerns, gender equality and human rights, while those embraced traditional values around material security and the protection of national culture and identity. Social democratic parties adopted left libertarian values and used them to attract the support of increasingly middle-class post-material voters by the 1990s. This process resulted in de-alignment among large sections of working-class voters who defected to smaller parties, as they became increasingly dependent on the emerging post-material electorate. The policy agendas of social democratic parties de-emphasized the politics of class in favor of more progressive socio-cultural agendas. The economic agendas of these parties came to increasingly resemble those of center-right parties, with the major differences between them residing on the values scale. This exacerbated the dilemma faced by social democratic parties, as the rise of post-material values had a neutral effect on party support and voting. The social bases of support for parties of the left have increasingly shifted towards the middle class, while those of traditional working class voters have shifted more towards parties of the right. The constituencies most overrepresented within the contemporary populist rights electorate are the petty bourgeoisie, older voters, male voters with low levels of education, and members of the religious and ethnic majority group. The key cause of support for right-wing populist parties across Western Europe is anxiety that rising levels of cultural change and increasing rates of immigration are eroding traditional values and cultural norms. However, its persistently higher levels of support reflect declining levels of economic and physical security among a subset of the population. Ingler Houghton Norris, 2017, suggests that the resurgence of authoritarian populists is likely to grow stronger due to rising levels of income insecurity among some of the most vulnerable people. Additionally, innovations in artificial intelligence and automation have begun to threaten the economic positions of those who are better off and have concentrated wealth at the top of society's socio-economic ladder. This shift towards an artificial intelligence society could have similar effects as the previous shift from the post-war economy to the knowledge economy.